I knew something was wrong the moment I saw her hand resting on that man's wrist like it belonged there. I was halfway through my dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant on the Upper West Side, the kind of place where the lighting is soft enough to forgive your age and the wine is always just a little too expensive, when I noticed her across the room. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker of familiarity, the kind you dismiss as coincidence. A pregnant woman, maybe in her late 30s, seated near the window, her silhouette framed by the city lights beyond the glass. She had her hand gently curved over her stomach, a protective gesture, almost instinctive. I would have looked away if it weren't for the way she tilted her head when she laughed. I had seen that exact movement before. Many times. I set my fork down slowly. The clink against the porcelain sounded louder than it should have. My heart didn't race. It didn't need to. It simply tightened. I leaned back slightly in my chair, just enough to see her more clearly without being obvious. The man across from her reached for her hand, his fingers brushing over hers before settling there, confident, familiar. Not hesitant. Not new. He said something that made her smile again, softer this time, and she looked down at her glass like a woman who felt safe. That was when she turned her face just enough for the light to catch it. And I saw her. Olivia. My daughter-in-law. I didn't move. Not a single inch. The world around me kept going, waiters passing, glasses clinking, quiet conversations folding into one another, but everything inside me went still. Olivia was supposed to be at a work conference in Boston. Daniel had told me that himself just 3 days ago, his voice tired but proud, like a husband supporting his busy, successful wife. I watched as the man across from her gently rested his hand on her stomach. Not awkwardly. Not uncertainly. He knew that space. He belonged there. My fingers curled slightly against the tablecloth. The fabric was crisp, expensive, neatly pressed. I focused on that detail for a moment, grounding myself in something simple, something real. Because nothing about what I was seeing felt real. Olivia had told me, just last Christmas that she wasn't ready for children yet. That she wanted to focus on her career. That motherhood was something for later. I remembered how Daniel had nodded, how he'd squeezed her hand under the table, how I had smiled and said I understood. And yet here she was. Pregnant. Radiant even. Sharing a quiet, intimate dinner with a man who was not my son. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't call her name. I simply watched. Because after 68 years of life, after raising a son, after burying a husband, I had learned one thing very well. The truth doesn't need to be chased. It reveals itself, if you're patient enough to sit still and see it clearly. I stayed in my seat long after my plate had gone cold, my hands folded neatly in my lap as if I were simply another woman enjoying a quiet evening alone, but my eyes never left that table by the window, not even when the waiter came to ask if everything was all right, and I nodded without really hearing him. Because everything was not all right, not even close, yet I refused to let that realization show on my face, not here. Not in a room full of strangers who had nothing to do with the quiet unraveling of my family. Olivia leaned forward slightly as she spoke, her voice too low for me to hear but her expression open in a way I had never seen before, not at our holiday dinners, not during the polite conversations she had with me over coffee. This was different, softer, unguarded, and the man across from her listened with a kind of attentiveness that felt practiced, like this was not their first dinner. Not even their fifth. His thumb brushed lightly across the back of her hand in a slow, absent motion, the kind that comes from familiarity, not excitement, and I felt something inside me settle into place, not panic, not anger, just a quiet, undeniable clarity, because moments like this do not lie, they do not exaggerate, they simply reveal what has already been there for longer than anyone wants to admit. I reached for my water glass and took a small sip, steadying myself, allowing the coolness to anchor me as my thoughts began to move more carefully, more deliberately. Daniel had told me she was in Boston. He had said it twice actually. Once over the phone and once again in a text message, as if repeating it made it more true, and I remembered how tired he sounded, how he mentioned working late, eating alone most nights, how he laughed it off like it was temporary, like it was normal, and I had believed him because that is what mothers do, we believe our children even when something feels slightly off. Even when the silence between their words carries more meaning than the words themselves. I watched Olivia as she adjusted her posture, one hand instinctively supporting her stomach as she shifted in her chair, and the man immediately noticed, leaning forward, asking something that made her nod, and then he signaled to the waiter without hesitation, ordering something for her without even looking at the menu, and she did not correct him, she did not hesitate, she simply smiled in quiet agreement, and that told me more than anything else could have. Because people only allow that kind of ease when they trust someone deeply, when they have already shared enough time to no longer question each other's choices. I placed my napkin carefully on the table and glanced around the restaurant, not to escape the moment but to contain it, to make sure it stayed where it belonged, inside me, controlled, observed, understood, because I knew that whatever this was, it was not something that could be solved by walking across the room and demanding answers, not yet. Answers given too early are rarely the truth, they are rehearsed, defensive, incomplete, and I had no interest in fragments. I wanted the whole picture, every detail, every connection, every quiet lie that had led to this single, undeniable moment. Olivia laughed again, softer this time, and the man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out something small, something metallic, and as he set it on the table between them, the light caught it just long enough for me to recognize it, and in that instant, something inside me shifted, not broken, not shaken, but sharpened, because I knew that object, I knew it better than I knew my own reflection, and there was no possible explanation for why it was sitting there, in front of them, unless everything I thought I understood about my family had already been quietly rewritten without me ever noticing. I did not need to lean closer to see it clearly, because I already knew what it was the moment the light touched its surface. The watch lay there between them, simple, elegant, unmistakable. A silver case with the dark leather strap worn just enough at the edges to show years of careful use, my husband's watch, the one he wore every single day for over 30 years, the one I had placed in the velvet box myself after we lost him. The one I had kept locked in the top drawer of my bedroom dresser because some things are not meant to be passed around, they are meant to be remembered, preserved, respected. And yet there it was, sitting casually on a restaurant table in front of a man I had never seen before, as if it belonged to him, as if it had always belonged to him. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the stem of my glass, but I did not move, I did not react, because reacting would mean accepting what I was seeing too quickly. And I had learned long ago that the first explanation is rarely the correct one. Especially when it comes to people you trust. Olivia reached for the watch with a soft smile, her fingertips brushing over it in a way that felt almost familiar, almost affectionate, and then she said something that made the man chuckle, and he pushed the watch a little closer to her, not possessively, not protectively, just easily, like two people sharing something that was already understood between them. And that was when the final piece settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a door closing in another room, because there was no version of reality where that watch ended up there by accident, no version where it was borrowed or misplaced without someone making a deliberate choice. And Olivia had been the only one in that house with access to my things after my husband passed. She had insisted on helping me organize, on sorting through his belongings when I could not bring myself to do it. She had stood beside me in that bedroom, her voice gentle, her hands careful, offering comfort, offering support, and I had trusted her, completely, without hesitation. I looked at her now, really looked at her, and for the first time I noticed the difference, not in her face, not in her posture, but in the way she existed in that moment. There was no trace of the careful politeness she showed me at family gatherings, no measured tone, no calculated pauses. She was relaxed, certain, entirely herself, and that version of her did not include us, not Daniel, not me, not the life she claimed to be building with my son. The man across from her picked up the watch again and fastened it around his wrist with practiced ease, adjusting the strap like he had done it 100 times before, and Olivia watched him with quiet approval, her hand resting once more on her stomach as if everything in her world was exactly as it should be. I let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, and lowered my gaze to the table in front of me, not in defeat, not in confusion, but in understanding, because the truth was no longer something I needed to search for, it was already here, laid out in front of me in small, undeniable details, and the only question left was not what had happened, but how long it had been happening without me ever seeing it. The drive home was quiet, but not empty. My mind did not race the way it might have years ago. It moved slowly, deliberately, like someone sorting through a box of old photographs, turning each one over, studying it from every angle until the truth behind the image became impossible to ignore. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, the engine off. The house in front of me dark except for the soft porch light I always left on, a habit I never broke even after my husband passed, as if part of me still expected someone to come home late and need that small, steady welcome. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me, the familiar scent of the house wrapping around me, wood polish, lavender, something faintly sweet from the candles I kept in the living room, everything exactly as it had been, untouched, unchanged, and yet it all felt different now, not because the house had changed, but because I had. I walked past the living room without turning on the lights and made my way upstairs, each step measured, unhurried, my hand gliding lightly along the banister that my husband had refinished himself years ago. I could still remember the way he had stood there, sleeves rolled up, smiling as he admired his work, proud of something so simple, so solid. I reached my bedroom and paused at the doorway before stepping inside. The room was just as I had left it that morning, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway to let in the last of the evening light, and on the dresser, the small wooden box where I kept the things that mattered. The things I was not ready to let go of. I crossed the room and opened the top drawer slowly, not because I expected anything different, but because part of me needed to see it with my own eyes, needed the confirmation that what I had seen was real, that it was not some trick of light or memory. The drawer slid open without resistance, and there it was, the empty space where the velvet box should have been. I did not reach in right away, I simply looked at it, at the absence. Because sometimes what is missing tells you more than what is present. Olivia had been the one to help me organize this drawer. She had stood right here, her voice soft, her movements careful, telling me it would be easier if everything had its place, and I had agreed, grateful for her kindness, grateful for the way she stepped in when I could not bring myself to touch my husband's belongings. I remembered how she had gently taken the watch from my hands that day, how she had said, "I will put this somewhere safe for you." And I had nodded, trusting her without question. Because that is what family is supposed to be, a place where trust does not need to be earned over and over again, it simply exists. I closed the drawer and rested my hand on the smooth wood, my reflection faintly visible in the mirror above it, and for a moment I studied the woman looking back at me, her silver hair neatly pulled back, her expression calm, almost unreadable. There were no tears, no visible cracks. Just a quiet understanding settling into place, because the watch had not been lost, it had not been misplaced, it had been taken, deliberately, quietly, and given to someone who had no right to it, and that meant this was not a single moment of betrayal, not an isolated mistake. This was something planned, something carried out over time with patience and intention. I turned off the bedroom light and walked back into the hallway, the house silent around me, but my thoughts no longer searching, no longer questioning. I did not need to wonder what I had seen or what it meant, I already knew. The only thing left now was to decide what I was going to do with the truth that had finally revealed itself. The next morning arrived the way most mornings do, quiet and unremarkable, sunlight slipping through the kitchen window, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the familiar rhythm of a house that had not yet realized something inside it had shifted. I moved through my routine without interruption, measuring coffee grounds, filling the kettle, placing my favorite mug on the counter as if nothing had changed, because outwardly, nothing had. The world does not pause for realizations, it continues. Indifferent, steady, and it is up to us to decide whether we keep pace or fall behind. I chose to keep pace. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my phone, not to distract myself, but to begin, because what I had seen the night before was not something that could be ignored or dismissed. It required understanding, not emotion. I opened my messages and scrolled back to Daniel's last text. She landed safely. Long conference days ahead, but she will call when she can. I read it twice, not because I doubted the words, but because I needed to see them in the light of what I now knew, and there it was, the first clear line between truth and fabrication. Olivia had not been in Boston, not last night, not recently. I set the phone down and reached for the small notepad I kept by the fruit bowl, a simple thing, lined paper, nothing remarkable, but it would serve its purpose. I wrote the date at the top. Then beneath it, a single word. Boston. And I drew a line. Through it, not dramatically, just cleanly, as if correcting a minor error, because that is what it was, an error in the story I had been given. I thought back over the past few months, not emotionally, but carefully, like reviewing a ledger. Olivia's schedule had always been busy, meetings, conferences, late nights, travel that seemed constant but never fully explained, and Daniel had accepted it, supported it even, proud of her ambition, proud of the life they were building, and I had accepted it too, because it was not my place to question the details of their marriage. But now those details mattered, now they formed a pattern, and patterns are not accidents. I picked up my phone again and opened Olivia's social media. Something I rarely checked, not out of disinterest, but out of respect. People are entitled to their private spaces, or at least the illusion of them. Her most recent post was from 3 days ago, a photo of a conference room, neatly arranged chairs, a caption about leadership and growth, nothing unusual, nothing that would raise suspicion on its own. But I noticed the timestamp, early morning, and I remembered where she had been that evening, at dinner, laughing softly. Her hand resting on a life she had never mentioned to us. I scrolled further, past weeks, past months. And the pattern began to take shape, carefully curated posts, always professional, always polished, never personal, no mention of family, no mention of Daniel, and certainly no mention of a pregnancy. I set the phone down once more and leaned back in my chair, my coffee untouched, cooling slowly in front of me, because the truth was no longer hidden behind a single moment, or a single object. It was woven through everything. Subtle, consistent, intentional, and that meant I was not looking at a mistake. I was looking at a life that had been constructed alongside the one we believed she was living, a second life, quiet, deliberate, and entirely separate. I glanced toward the staircase, imagining Daniel still asleep upstairs, unaware, trusting, moving through his days with the certainty that his life was exactly what he thought it was, and for a moment, just a moment, I considered what it would mean to tell him. To place this truth directly in front of him without warning, but I let that thought pass, not because he did not deserve to know, but because the truth, when given too early, can break more than it reveals, and I was not interested in breaking anything without understanding it first. I picked up my pen again and wrote another word beneath Boston. Watch. And this time, I did not cross it out. I underlined it, slowly, deliberately, because that was not an error, that was evidence. And evidence does not speak loudly, it waits patiently until someone is ready to listen. I closed the notepad and placed it beside my cup, my reflection faint in the dark surface of the coffee, calm, steady, unchanged, because whatever Olivia thought she had hidden, whatever life she believed existed beyond our reach, she had made one mistake. She assumed I would not notice, she assumed I would not look closely enough to see the truth. And that assumption would cost her more than she realized. By mid-morning, the house had settled into its usual quiet, but my thoughts had not. They moved with purpose now, no longer circling the same questions, no longer searching for explanations that would make everything simpler, because simplicity no longer applied. I stood by the kitchen window, watching a delivery truck pass slowly down the street, its engine low, steady, predictable. Everything about it made sense. Unlike the life I had been looking at for the past 24 hours, I picked up my phone again, not to revisit what I already knew, but to begin confirming what I suspected. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years, Thomas Green, my husband's former business partner, a man who had been part of our lives for decades before gradually stepping back after retirement. He was careful, observant, the kind of man who noticed details others overlooked, and more importantly, he understood how things moved behind the scenes. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice older, slower, but still clear, still steady. We exchanged brief pleasantries, the kind that fill space without saying much, and then I asked the question that had been forming since the night before. I described the man I had seen at the restaurant, not emotionally, not with accusation, just facts, height, build, the way he carried himself. The watch on his wrist. There was a pause on the other end, longer than it should have been, and when Thomas spoke again, his tone had shifted, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He asked me where I had seen this man, and when I told him, he exhaled slowly, as if confirming something he had. And entirely deliberate, I would not confront Olivia, I would not question Daniel, and I would not allow a single hint of suspicion to reach either of them. Not yet, because the truth I was uncovering was still incomplete, and incomplete truths are dangerous. They lead to emotional reactions instead of precise actions, and I was no longer interested in reacting. I was interested in understanding everything. Completely, I walked into my study, a room that had once belonged to my husband, still arranged the way he preferred, books aligned neatly on the shelves, files stored in labeled drawers, a sense of order that had always grounded him, and now, it grounded me. I sat down at his old desk and opened the bottom drawer where he used to keep his business records, not because I expected to find something obvious, but because I knew that if this situation connected to his past, then the answers would not be far from where he had left them. I pulled out a folder labeled simply with initials, something he often did to keep things discreet, and as I flipped through the pages, names began to appear, some familiar, some distant. But one stood out immediately, the same name Thomas had mentioned earlier that morning, written in my husband's careful handwriting beside a series of notes, dates, and financial figures. I paused there, my fingers resting lightly on the paper, because this was no longer coincidence. This was confirmation. The man I had seen was not just connected to my husband's past, he had been involved in something significant, something important enough to be documented, and possibly important enough to revisit. I closed the folder slowly and leaned back in the chair, my mind no longer piecing together fragments, but assembling a structure, something clearer, more defined. Olivia had access to this house, to these records, to the history she had never fully belonged to, and somehow she had found a way to connect herself to it, not accidentally, not unknowingly, but intentionally, and that meant her relationship with that man was not just personal. It was strategic. I stood up and walked toward the window, the afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, everything outside moving as usual, neighbors passing by, cars pulling in and out of driveways, a world that had no awareness of what was unfolding behind closed doors. I remained still for a moment, letting the silence settle, because clarity does not come from movement, it comes from stillness, from allowing everything you have seen to settle into its proper place. And now, everything was beginning to make sense, not in a way that brought comfort, but in a way that removed doubt. I returned the folder to its place, exactly as I had found it, and closed the drawer with care. Because whatever came next required precision, not disruption. I would not alert them, I would not give them time to adjust or prepare. They had moved quietly, patiently, believing their actions would go unnoticed, and I would do the same. I would move quietly, patiently, watching, gathering, understanding every detail before making a single move, because in situations like this, the person who speaks first rarely holds the advantage. It is the one who listens, who observes, who waits until the truth is complete, and I was more than willing to wait, because now, I was no longer uncertain. I was no longer questioning what I had seen. I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and more importantly, I knew that whatever they believed they were building, they had not accounted for me being part of the equation, and that would be their second mistake. By the time evening settled in again, I had already decided what my next move would be, not because I felt rushed, but because clarity brings a certain kind of calm that does not allow hesitation. I prepared dinner the way I always did when Daniel was coming over, simple, familiar, nothing that would raise suspicion, roasted chicken, vegetables, a table set with the same care I had given it for years. Because routine is the easiest mask to wear, it reassures people, it tells them everything is as it should be, and that was exactly what I needed them to believe. Daniel arrived just after 6, his footsteps heavy on the porch, his expression tired but warm when he walked through the door. He greeted me with the same quiet affection he always had, unaware of anything beyond the surface of his own life, and I returned that warmth without hesitation, because none of this was about punishing him, not yet. We sat down at the table and began to eat, conversation moving easily at first, his work, the usual small updates, the kind of things that fill space without requiring much thought, and then, almost casually, he mentioned Olivia, how busy she had been, how demanding the conference schedule was, how she might extend her stay for a few more days. I nodded, listening carefully, not to what he said, but to how he said it, the certainty in his voice, the complete absence of doubt. And it confirmed what I had already suspected. He did not know, not even a fraction of it. I reached for my glass and took a small sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel natural before speaking again. I asked him if Olivia had been traveling a lot recently, not as an accusation, but as a simple question, the kind a mother might ask out of mild curiosity, and he answered without hesitation, listing cities, dates, meetings, everything neatly organized, everything believable on its own. And yet none of it aligned with what I had seen. I let him finish without interruption, my expression calm, my tone steady when I responded, because the goal was not to challenge him, it was to understand the boundaries of what he believed. After dinner, as he stood to clear his plate, I stopped him gently, not with urgency, but with quiet intention. I told him I had been thinking about reorganizing some of his father's old records, that there were things I wanted to review. And I asked if he would mind if I reached out to a few of his father's former associates, just to clarify some details. He looked at me with mild surprise, but no suspicion. He agreed easily, even offered to help if I needed it, and in that moment, I saw exactly how far removed he was from everything unfolding around him. I thanked him, not for his permission, but for confirming what I needed to know, that I could move forward without interference, without resistance, without drawing attention. He left shortly after, the house returning to its usual quiet once again, and I stood alone in the kitchen. The dishes still on the table, the remnants of a normal evening scattered around me, but nothing about this was normal anymore. I walked to the window and looked out into the darkened street, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, steady, composed, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that stillness, everything was moving into place, because tonight had not been about gathering new information, it had been about confirming what remained hidden, about understanding who knew and who did not. And now I had my answer. Daniel was not part of this, not knowingly, and that meant the path forward was clearer than ever. I would not confront, I would not accuse, I would build, piece by piece, quietly, patiently, until there was nothing left for them to deny. Because whatever story Olivia believed she was living, whatever future she thought she was securing, she had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed the past would stay buried, she assumed no one would look closely enough to uncover it, and she was wrong. The following morning, I did not rush into anything, because the strongest moves are never made in haste, they are built quietly, layered carefully, until the outcome becomes inevitable. I sat at the same kitchen table, my coffee warm in my hands, the notepad still resting beside me with only 2 words written on it, Boston and watch, and now, I added a third, a name, the one Thomas had given me. I wrote it slowly, deliberately, letting the ink settle into the paper as if it carried more weight than the others, because it did. Names connect people, they reveal paths, they expose intentions, and this name was no exception. I reached for my phone and began searching, not broadly, not carelessly, but with precision, business records, old articles, archived mentions, and it did not take long before the pieces began to align. The man was not just part of my husband's past. He had been involved in a financial dispute years ago, something that had been resolved quietly, without publicity. Something my husband had handled himself, and suddenly, everything shifted from personal betrayal to something far more calculated. I leaned back in my chair, my mind no longer questioning but confirming. Olivia had not simply formed a relationship outside of her marriage, she had positioned herself within a network that existed long before she entered our lives, and that meant her presence had purpose. Her actions had direction, and nothing about this was accidental. I closed my eyes for a Brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but to allow the full picture to settle, because understanding changes the way you move. It removes hesitation, it replaces uncertainty with intent, and when I opened my eyes again, I already knew what needed to happen next. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, past the framed photographs, past the memories that now felt like carefully arranged scenes in a story I had not fully read, and I paused at the end of the hall where the guest room door stood slightly open. Olivia's things still neatly arranged from her last visit, her suitcase tucked beside the dresser, her presence lingering in small, subtle ways. I stepped inside and looked around, not searching in a frantic way, but observing, taking in the details, the order, the precision, and then I opened the top drawer of the nightstand, not because I expected to find something obvious, but because habits leave traces, and people rarely realize where those traces remain. Inside was a small envelope, plain, unmarked, and I picked it up carefully. Sliding out the contents without rushing, inside were documents. Copies, not originals, but detailed enough to reveal their purpose, property information, transfer records, financial summaries, all connected to assets I recognized, assets that had once belonged to my husband. I did not react outwardly, I did not allow the weight of it to show, because this was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for recognition. The pattern was complete now, no longer fragmented, no longer uncertain. Olivia had not just taken a watch, she had taken access, she had taken knowledge, and she had aligned herself with someone who knew how to use both. I returned the documents exactly as I had found them, placing the envelope back into the drawer with the same care, the same precision, because nothing could be disturbed yet, nothing could be revealed too soon. I stepped out of the room and closed the door gently behind me, the house silent once more, but no longer still. Because now everything was in motion, not around me, but because of me. I walked back toward the kitchen, my reflection catching briefly in the glass of the window, calm, composed, unchanged. But beneath that calm, every piece was now in place, and for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I was no longer watching, I was preparing, because they had built something carefully, quietly, believing it would remain hidden, believing it would succeed.